Rael stood before the mirror in his quarters, his 8-foot frame casting a long shadow in the dim light. His iridescent scales shifted from deep purple to midnight blue as he moved, while his razor-sharp claws clicked against the metal floor. As a Vaxian, he had grown used to the fearful glances and hurried steps of other species aboard Station Neo-Sol. Looking at his reflection, he gently touched the mirror with one clawed hand. The station's artificial lighting made his scales glitter like stars in the night sky. He knew his appearance frightened others. The rows of protective scales, the curved claws that could tear through metal, and the silver eyes that seemed to glow in darkness. But they were all just tools his species had evolved to survive their harsh homeworld, not weapons of war. The morning routine never changed. Rael would check the station's internal scheduling system, waiting for the quietest hours before leaving his quarters. He had memorized every maintenance shift change, every trading cycle, and every transport arrival. It was easier this way, both for him and for the others who lived on the station. Today, like every day, he watched the clock tick slowly toward the least crowded hour. His quarters, though spacious by station standards, felt like a cage. The walls were decorated with crystal artworks he had brought from home, delicate structures that caught and split light into rainbow patterns. Most would be surprised to learn that his massive claws could create such beautiful, fragile things. When the time came, Rael stepped out into the corridor. The effect was immediate. A group of Terran traders stopped mid-conversation, pressing themselves against the wall. A young Meridian mother quickly pulled her child behind her. Even the station's cleaning drones seemed to alter their paths to maintain maximum distance. He kept his head high but his eyes down, a posture he had perfected over his 2 years on the station. It made him appear less threatening while allowing him to watch for those who might cross his path. His steps were measured and slow, though he could move with surprising speed when needed. The station's main promenade was his destination. He had a scheduled meeting with the station's council. As he walked, the normal buzz of station life fell silent in his wake. Shop owners who had been calling out to customers suddenly found inventory to count. The usually aggressive Krax mercenaries, known throughout the galaxy for their fearlessness, suddenly remembered urgent appointments in other sectors. Rael's sensitive hearing picked up the whispers that followed him. Monster, some said. Predator, others murmured. Why do they let it roam free? The words stung, but he had learned to carry their weight. In the early days of his assignment, he had tried to smile at passersby, hoping to show his friendly nature. But his sharp teeth had only caused more panic. He had attempted to join community gatherings, only to watch them slowly empty as others made excuses to leave. Even the station's diplomatic corps, trained to deal with all species, struggled to hide their discomfort during official meetings. The loneliness was the heaviest burden. Back home on Vaxia, his people lived in large, close-knit communities. They were social creatures who shared everything: meals, art, music, and daily life. The crystal caves they called home would echo with laughter and song. Young ones would climb playfully over the adults, their claws still soft and scales still dull. Elders would share stories while working on their crystal art, their scales faded to pale pastels with age. Here, he was the only one of his kind. His quarters remained silent except for the hum of station systems. No one sought his company for pleasure, only necessity. As an ambassador, he was meant to forge connections between his people and others. But how could he build bridges when everyone ran at the sight of him? Reaching the council chamber, Rael paused to compose himself. Through the door, he could hear the council members shifting nervously in their seats, already aware of his arrival. He would enter, make his reports, and they would nod politely while maintaining their distance. Then he would return to his quarters, alone again, to wait for another day. His claws clicked against the floor as he straightened his diplomatic sash. The council had requested updates on trade possibilities with his world. The irony wasn't lost on him. They'd wanted Vaxian crystal art and technology, but could barely stand to be in the same room as a Vaxian. Still, he would do his duty, hoping that someday, someone would see past his fearsome exterior to who he really was. As the door slid open, Rael took a deep breath and entered the chamber. The familiar scene played out, council members tensing in their chairs, hands gripping armrests, forced smiles that didn't reach their eyes. He was their monster, their diplomatic necessity, their feared ambassador. But most of all, he was alone. A djinn rushed through the dimly lit corridors of Station Neo-Soul's engineering section, her boots making quick, sharp sounds against the metal floor. She was already 20 minutes late for her maintenance shift, and Chief Engineer Park would not be happy. Her long black hair, hastily tied back, was coming loose as she ran, toolkit bouncing against her hip. The engineering section was a maze of pipes, conduits, and narrow passages. Usually, He-Jin could navigate them without thinking, but in her hurry, she took a corner too fast. She didn't see the tall figure until it was too late. The collision sent her sprawling, and her toolkit crashed open, sending tools sliding across the floor in all directions. Her first thought was about her precious tools. Some had belonged to her father. Then she looked up, and up, and up, at the figure standing before her. The Vaxian towered over her, his scales shifting colors in the overhead lights. He-Jin had heard stories about the station's sole Vaxian resident, but this was her first time seeing him up close. Where others saw a monster, she saw something different. His silver eyes held a depth of emotion she hadn't expected. There was sadness there, and loneliness. It reminded her of the stray cats she used to feed back on Earth, creatures that others feared but just needed someone to understand them. "I'm so sorry. Here, let me help you," the Vaxian said, his deep voice surprisingly gentle. He knelt down, and He-Jin watched in fascination as his massive claws delicately picked up her scattered tools. His movements were precise and careful, handling even the smallest screwdrivers with unexpected grace. "You have such beautiful scales," He-Jin blurted out before she could stop herself. Her face immediately felt hot with embarrassment. Of all the things to say to a diplomatic ambassador, she had to comment on his appearance like a child. But the Vaxian froze, his silver eyes widening slightly. The scales along his neck rippled, changing from deep blue to a softer purple. "I thank you," he said, sounding genuinely surprised. "I'm Rael." "I'm He-Jin," she replied, finally getting to her feet. "I'm sorry for running into you. I'm late for my shift, and I wasn't watching where I was going." Rael handed her the toolkit, now neatly repacked. No harm done. Though perhaps running in the engineering section isn't the safest choice. There was a hint of humor in his voice that made He-Jin smile. "Probably not my best decision," she admitted. "But Chief Park gets grumpy when we're late, and I'm already in trouble." She checked her watch and winced. "Make that a lot of trouble." "I could explain to your chief that I delayed you," Rael offered. "It's the least I can do after our collision." He-Jin was about to refuse, but something in his expression made her pause. Was he looking for a reason to talk more? The thought made her heart ache a little. How lonely must it be, having everyone avoid you? "Actually, that would be really helpful," she said, "if you don't mind." Rael's scales shifted again, this time to a brighter blue that seemed to shimmer. "Not at all. I know Chief Park. We've met during station council meetings." They walked together toward the main engineering bay, and He-Jin noticed how other crew members quickly moved aside. But instead of feeling afraid, she felt angry on Rael's behalf. Couldn't they see how gentle he was? "So, what brings you to the engineering section?" she asked, trying to ignore the stares they were getting. "I was inspecting the crystal power regulators," Rael explained. "They're based on Vaxian technology, and sometimes they need adjustments that others might miss." "The crystal regulators, those are amazing." He-Jin's eyes lit up. "The way they channel and focus energy is unlike anything in human tech. I've been studying them whenever I have free time." Rael looked down at her with newfound interest. "You understand crystal technology?" "Well, I'm learning." Jin said modestly. There's so much to understand. The crystalline structure, the energy flow patterns, the resonance frequencies. They reached the main engineering bay too quickly. Chief Park was indeed waiting, his face set in its usual scowl, but it softened slightly at the sight of Rail. The Vaxian explained the situation smoothly, taking full responsibility for Heijin's tardiness. As Heijin headed to her workstation, Rail called out softly, "If you're interested in crystal technology, I could teach you more. I helped design some of these systems." She turned back, smiling brightly. "I'd like that very much." Watching him leave, Heijin realized that her morning's accident might have been the luckiest collision of her life. She had a feeling this was just the beginning of something interesting. Over the next few weeks, Heijin found herself making excuses to work near Rail's quarters. A loose panel here, a faulty sensor there. She always found something that needed fixing. She noticed that Rail too seemed to have reasons to visit the engineering section more often than before, checking on crystal regulators or offering technical advice. Their first planned meeting happened in a quiet corner of the station's hydroponic gardens. Heijin had brought her lunch, and Rail had brought something that looked like glowing blue crystals. He explained they were a traditional Vaxian food, grown in the depths of their crystal caves. "Would you like to try one?" he asked, holding out the crystal with his careful claws. Heijin didn't hesitate. The crystal dissolved on her tongue like cotton candy, leaving a taste of something sweet and fresh. "It's like biting into morning sunshine," she said, making Rail's scales ripple with pleasure. They met regularly after that, finding quiet spots away from the busy main corridors. Heijin learned that Rail's fearsome claws could create delicate crystal art, and he showed her small pieces he had made. She taught him about human customs, explaining jokes and idioms that had always confused him. "Your people built entire cities in crystal caves?" Heijin asked during one of their meetings, leaning forward with interest. They were sitting in a maintenance alcove, sharing their lunch break. "Yes," Rail said, his silver eyes brightening with memories of home. "The caves stretch for hundreds of miles beneath our planet's surface. We learned to grow the crystals into homes, shops, even transportation networks." His usual defensive posture relaxed as he spoke, his shoulders dropping, his movements becoming more fluid. "And when our 3 moons align," he continued, using his claws to sketch patterns in the air, "the light filters through the crystal cities, creating rainbow auroras throughout the caverns. Every surface comes alive with color. Young ones chase the light patterns, and artists create special sculptures that only reveal their true beauty during the alignment." Station security officer Jaiho watched their growing friendship with obvious concern. He started appearing more frequently in areas where they met, his hand always near his stunner. But Heijin ignored his presence, just as she ignored the whispers and stares from other station residents. During one lunch, a group of engineers walked by, their conversation dropping to harsh whispers as they passed. Heijin saw Rail's scales darken slightly, a sign she now knew meant distress. "Tell me more about your art," she said quickly, drawing his attention back. "How do you shape the crystals?" Rail's scales lightened again. "It's all about understanding the crystal's natural growth patterns," he explained, demonstrating with small movements of his claws. "We don't force the crystal, we guide it. Like your earth gardeners training a bonsai tree." Their friendship grew stronger with each meeting. Heijin learned to read the subtle changes in his scale colors. Bright blue for happiness, deep purple for thought, a shimmer of green for amusement. Rail learned to laugh at her jokes, though his laugh was more like a rumbling purr that made nearby equipment vibrate slightly. One day, Heijin arrived at their usual meeting spot to find Rail holding something wrapped in soft cloth. "I made this for you," he said, carefully unwrapping a small crystal sculpture. It captured a moment of their first meeting, her scattered tools frozen in mid-fall, caught in crystal-like insects in amber. "Rail, it's beautiful," she whispered, turning it to watch light play through the crystal. Each tool was perfectly detailed, down to the maker's marks on her old wrenches. Security officer Jeho chose that moment to walk past, his face darkening at the sight of them. Maintenance worker Hejin, he said stiffly, remember station regulations about accepting gifts from diplomatic personnel. It's a cultural exchange item, Hejin replied smoothly, having memorized station regulations herself. And I'm off duty. After Jeho left, Rail's scales had darkened again. Perhaps I shouldn't have, he began, but Hejin cut him off. Don't you dare apologize, she said firmly. This is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me, and I'm keeping it. The smile that spread across Rail's face made his scales shimmer like starlight. In that moment, Hejin couldn't understand how anyone could see him as frightening. All she saw was her friend, who created beauty with his fearsome claws and held gentleness in his silver eyes. As they sat together, sharing stories and food, neither of them noticed that some of the passing station residents had stopped staring in fear. Instead, they were watching with curiosity, seeing something they hadn't expected. A massive Vaxian laughing softly at a human girl's jokes, his deadly claws carefully holding a cup of tea she had brought him, while she gestured enthusiastically about Earth customs, completely at ease in his presence. Hejin sat cross-legged in Rail's quarters, surrounded by his crystal artwork. It was late evening by station time, and the room's lighting was dimmed to match the natural cycle. The crystals caught what little light there was, creating soft patterns on the walls that reminded her of starlight on water. I've always wondered, she said, watching Rail work on a new crystal piece, why did your people develop such impressive natural defenses if you're primarily artists and scientists? Rail's claws paused in their delicate work. His scales shifted to a deeper blue as he considered her question. We were never warriors, he explained, setting down his tools. Everything about us evolved to survive our world's harsh environment. He held up one massive hand, spreading his curved claws. These weren't meant for fighting. They developed for climbing the crystal formations in our caves. The crystal mountains are treacherous, smooth and sharp at the same time. Without these claws, we couldn't reach the higher caves where the best growing conditions are. Hejin leaned closer, fascinated. She'd grown comfortable enough with Rail to study his features openly now. His scales rippled with changing colors as he spoke, like the surface of a soap bubble. And your scales? She asked. They're beautiful, but they must serve a purpose too. Protection from radiation, Rail explained, running a claw gently over his arm. Our world has 3 suns and 3 moons. When they align, the crystal caves amplify their radiation. Our scales evolve to reflect and absorb it. That's why they change color. They're constantly adapting to different energy levels. He picked up a small crystal, turning it in the light. We learned to work with crystals because they were everywhere in our environment. Over generations, we discovered how to shape them, grow them, use them to store energy and information. We became artists because beauty was abundant in our world, and scientists because we needed to understand it. Hejin thought about the fear she still saw in other residents' eyes when Rail passed by. But when your people first met other species? Yes, Rail's scales darkened slightly. The first contact was unfortunate. A trading vessel landed without warning near one of our crystal cities. Their sensors had detected the energy signatures from our technology. They saw our appearance and assumed we were savage predators living in caves. He paused, his silver eyes distant with memory. They tried to take some of our crystal tech by force. We defended ourselves, of course. News spread quickly through the galaxy. Beware the monstrous factions with their deadly claws and impenetrable scales. But that's not fair. Hejin protested. You were just protecting your homes. We look like predators, Rail said softly. So that's what everyone assumes we must be. Few bother to learn that our cities are filled with art galleries, not armories. That our children spend their days learning crystal harmonics instead of combat techniques. That our most honored citizens are those who create beauty, not those who destroy it. The Jinn watched as Rael returned to his crystal work. His massive claws moved with incredible precision, coaxing the crystal to grow in delicate spirals. "Is that why you became an ambassador?" she asked. "Yes, I thought if other species could see us as we truly are." He trailed off, his scales flickering with emotion. "But it's difficult to change perceptions. People see these claws and scales, and their minds are already made up." "I see you," He Jin said quietly. "I see how carefully you handle everything, how beautifully you create, how gently you move despite your strength. Others will see it too, given time." Rael's scales brightened slightly at her words. "You were the first one here who wasn't afraid to look closer, the first to ask questions instead of making assumptions." He held up the crystal he was working on. In its depths, Huijin could see a perfect replica of Station Neo-Sol, each detail captured in miniature. But unlike the real station, in this version, all species mingled freely in the corridors. She could even see a tiny crystal version of herself and Rael, sitting together in the hydroponic gardens. "This is how it could be," Rael said. "How it should be." "It will be," Heijin promised. "People just need to understand, like I did." As they sat together in the quiet room, surrounded by the artwork of a species everyone feared, Heijin realized something important. Sometimes the most dangerous assumptions weren't about what others might do to us, but about what we never give them the chance to show us instead. The alarms blared through Station Neo-Sol without warning. Red emergency lights flashed in every corridor as the computer system announced in multiple languages. "Critical reactor failure. All personnel evacuate sections 15 through 22 immediately." Heijin was in the middle of routine maintenance when her diagnostic panel suddenly lit up with warning signals. The primary reactor's containment field was failing. Her heart nearly stopped as she saw the radiation levels climbing rapidly. At this rate, the reactor would breach within 30 minutes, taking half the station with it. She rushed to engineering control where Chief Park was already barking orders. Emergency crews in radiation suits were preparing to enter the reactor chamber, but Heijin could see the problem immediately. The maintenance access tunnels were barely wide enough for a person. The bulky radiation suits would never fit. "The coolant system's main crystal regulator has shattered," Chief Park announced, his face grim. "Without it, we can't stabilize the core, and we can't reach it through the maintenance shafts with our suits." Heijin's mind raced. The crystal regulator, Vaxian technology. Rael, his scales could handle radiation that would kill others. She turned and ran, ignoring Chief Park's shouts behind her. She found Rael already moving through the panicking crowds toward the reactor section. His scales were shifting rapidly between colors, but his silver eyes were focused and calm. "The maintenance shafts are too narrow for radiation suits," she explained quickly, catching up to him. "But you could fit. The crystal regulator." "I know," Rael said. "I can feel the reactor's instability from here. My scales are already adapting to the radiation levels." Security Officer Jaiho appeared, blocking their path. "Ambassador, this area is under evacuation orders. You need to." "He's the only one who can save the station," Heijin interrupted. "His scales can protect him from the radiation, and he understands the crystal technology better than anyone." Jaiho hesitated, looking between them. The station shuddered as another surge hit the reactor. Finally, he stepped aside. "Do what you need to do." They reached the reactor control room, where engineering crews were desperately trying to contain the breach. Chief Park turned as they entered, his eyes widening at the sight of Rael. "I can fix this," Rael said simply, "but I need direct access to the crystal regulator." The chief didn't waste time arguing. "Maintenance Shaft 3 leads directly to the regulator chamber, but the radiation levels in there won't harm me," Rael finished. He turned to Heijin. "Guide me through the shaft system." She nodded, moving to the control panel. As Rael approached the maintenance shaft entrance, the crowd of engineers parted. Some still showed fear, but now there was something else in their expressions: hope. The regulator chamber is 3 turns left, then straight down, Hujin said through the comm system. Be careful of the emergency bulkheads. They're starting to seal automatically. Rail's massive form disappeared into the shaft. Heijin watched through the monitoring system as he moved with surprising speed and grace through the narrow space. His scales were now glowing slightly, absorbing the increasing radiation. First turn complete, his calm voice came through the comm. Radiation levels rising. My scales are compensating. The station shuddered again. Warning lights flashed as another system began to fail. Hajin could hear the fear in the voices around her, but she focused on Rail's steady progress. Second turn clear. The heat is intense. I can see the damaged regulator ahead. The main viewing screen showed Rail reaching the regulator chamber. The crystal technology that usually glowed with soft blue light was now angry red, cracks spreading across its surface. Radiation levels in the chamber were far beyond lethal. The crystal's resonance pattern is completely disrupted, Rail reported. I need to realign it manually. Heijin watched in amazement as his claws, those same claws that others feared, began to work with incredible precision. He touched specific points on the crystal's surface, his natural understanding of the technology guiding his movements. The radiation is affecting the crystal's growth pattern, he explained as he worked. I'm redirecting it, like shaping a new piece of art. It's fighting me, but... The station lurched violently. Heijin grabbed the console to stay upright. Rail. For a moment, there was silence. Then, almost, there. On the screen, they could see the crystal beginning to change. The angry red glow softened to purple, then to its normal blue. The radiation readings started to drop. Core temperature falling, someone announced. Containment field stabilizing. Radiation levels returning to normal parameters. Crystal regulator functioning at 98% capacity. Heijin felt tears of relief in her eyes as Rail emerged from the maintenance shaft. His scales were still glowing faintly, but he appeared unhurt. The engineering crew stared at him in silence. Then Chief Park stepped forward and bowed deeply. You saved us all, he said simply. Others began to move forward too, offering thanks and congratulations. Even Jiho managed a respectful nod. Heijin noticed that for the first time, no one was backing away from Rail in fear. Later, after the crisis had passed and the cleanup was underway, Heijin found Rail in his quarters. How are you feeling? She asked. My scales are still processing the radiation, he said, but I'm fine. Heijin, thank you for believing I could help. She smiled. I told you people would see the real you eventually. Sometimes it just takes a crisis to open their eyes. His scales shifted to that bright blue she now recognized as happiness. Perhaps now they'll understand. These claws and scales aren't weapons. They're tools, like any others. It's how we choose to use them that matters. The days following the reactor crisis brought noticeable changes to Station Neo-Seoul. As repair teams worked to restore damaged systems, something else was being repaired too. The broken trust between the station's residents and their Vaxian ambassador. Rail was checking the newly installed crystal regulators when Security Officer Jiho approached him. The officer's usual stern expression was gone, replaced by something more thoughtful. Jiho stopped a few feet away and bowed deeply. We owe you our lives, Jiho said, straightening up. I was wrong about you. We all were. His hands, which had always hovered near his stunner when Rail was present, now hung relaxed at his sides. Rail's scales shifted to a soft purple of surprise. You were protecting your people, he said gently. I understand that. No, Jiho shook his head. I let fear cloud my judgment. I saw a threat where there was none. My job is to recognize the difference between real dangers and unfair assumptions. I failed at that. As they talked, a small group of engineering crew members gathered nearby. Instead of their usual nervous glances, they watched with open curiosity. One of them, a young technician named Min-Ki, stepped forward hesitantly. "Ambassador Rail," he said, "would you be willing to teach us more about crystal technology? After seeing how you handled the reactor, well, we realized how little we understand about the systems we work with." Rail's scales brightened. "I would be happy to share my knowledge." Word spread quickly through the station. People who had once crossed corridors to avoid Rail now stopped to greet him. Questions about vaccine culture and technology replaced fearful whispers. In the hydroponic gardens, a group of artists asked him about crystal sculpting techniques. Even the children's behavior changed dramatically. Where they had once hidden behind their parents, they now waved excitedly when they saw him. Some of the braver ones would run up to ask questions about his color-changing scales, or to show him their drawings of him saving the station. Hajin watched all this with quiet joy. During their shared lunch breaks, she noticed how other crew members would now join them, eager to learn more about vaccine customs. The quiet corners they had once hidden in became gathering spots for impromptu cultural exchanges. Look who finally decided to show his real colors, she teased one afternoon, watching Rail demonstrate crystal growing techniques to a fascinated group of science officers. His scales rippled with amusement. "They're showing their real colors too," he replied, nodding toward the crowd. "Fear can make us all hide our true selves." The station council officially recognized Rail's heroism by creating a new position for him, cultural and technical advisor. His quarters were expanded to include a teaching space where he could share his knowledge of crystal technology and vaccine artistry. One evening, as they walked through the promenade, a small girl broke away from her mother and ran up to Rail. Instead of showing fear at his massive claws, she held up a crystal pendant she was wearing. "Mommy says your people made this," she said excitedly. "Can you tell me how it works?" Rail knelt down carefully, bringing himself closer to her level. His scales shifted to their gentlest blues as he explained how the crystal captured and reflected light. The girl's mother watched without anxiety, smiling at her daughter's enthusiasm. "I told you they just needed to know the real you," Hajin said later, as they watched the station's artificial sunset from the observation deck. "You were the first to see past appearances," Rail replied. "You showed others it was possible." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the light play across the station's crystal arrays. Technology that was no longer feared but appreciated for its beauty and efficiency. Below them, in the promenade, species of all kinds mingled freely. "Chief Park asked me to start a training program," Rail said suddenly, "teaching maintenance crews about crystal technology. He thinks combining vaccine knowledge with human engineering could lead to significant improvements." "See," Heijin grinned, "from feared alien to respected teacher. Though I hope you'll still have time for our lunch breaks." Rail's scales shimmered with happiness. "Always. After all, it was during those lunches that I learned the most important lesson about stations like this. Sometimes the strongest bonds are forged in the quietest moments, when we take the time to truly see each other." As if to prove his point, a group of children ran past, waving at both of them. Their parents followed more slowly, exchanging friendly nods with Rail. No one flinched at his claws or scales anymore. Instead, they saw what Hajin had seen from the beginning. Not a monster, but a person whose differences made him uniquely capable of helping others. The station had changed, but more importantly, its people had changed. Fear had given way to understanding, and isolation had been replaced by connection. And it had all started with one collision in an engineering corridor, when someone chose to look past appearances and see the truth beneath. 1 year had passed since the reactor incident, and Station Neo-Seoul had transformed into something remarkable. Rail's teaching space, once just an extension of his quarters, had grown into a thriving cultural center where species from across the galaxy gathered to learn and share. This particular evening, Rail was teaching a class on crystal weaving, a delicate art form that required precise control and patience. His students included humans, cracks, meridians, and even a few species he had never expected to work with. His massive claws moved with practiced grace as he demonstrated the basic techniques. In the front row, The young Crack's child watched with complete focus, her usually aggressive species features softened with concentration as she attempted to manipulate the crystal strands. Her parents, once among the station's most fearsome mercenaries, now regularly attended these classes, their warrior culture finding unexpected common ground with Vaxian artistic traditions. Hejin moved through the room, helping students adjust their techniques and translating some of Rael's more technical explanations into simpler terms. She had become an expert at bridging cultural gaps, just as she had once bridged the gap between Rael and the station's residents. Gentle pressure, she advised the Crack's child, who was gripping her crystal too tightly. Remember what Rael said. We guide the crystal, we don't force it. The child adjusted her grip, and the crystal began to glow softly, its structure starting to shift into the desired pattern. Her delighted chirp made several students look up and smile. After class, as the students filed out, many stopped to thank Rael or show him their progress. No one flinched when his claws carefully handled their work. No one backed away when his scales shifted colors with pride at their achievements. Later, Rael and Hejin sat in the observation lounge, watching Station Neosol's daily operations through the massive viewport. Repair crews worked alongside Vaxian technical advisors, implementing crystal technology improvements throughout the station. In the gardens below, children of various species played games that mixed traditions from multiple worlds. Did you ever imagine this? Hejin asked, watching the young Crack's child from earlier proudly showing her crystal creation to her warrior parents.